Every year, 1.5 million people visit the White House. They stand behind the iron fence on Pennsylvania Avenue, cameras raised, capturing the most recognizable address in America. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the symbol of democracy, the home of presidents. Tour groups listen to stories about renovations and state dinners. School children learn about the Oval Office. Tourists buy postcards showing the pristine white columns gleaming in the sun. What they don't learn is this. According to construction records held by the National Archives, the hands that laid those first stones, that carved those columns, that built the foundation of American democracy itself, belonged to people who had no freedom. The White House wasn't just built in a nation that permitted slavery. It was built by enslaved people. And for over 200 years, that truth was deliberately left out of almost every official tour, every history textbook, every story told about this building. The records are clear. They've always been there, tucked away in account ledgers from 1792. Names listed next to dollar amounts. But the money didn't go to the people doing the work. It went to the men who claimed to own them. This isn't speculation, it's documented. Commissioners' reports from the construction period identify them by first name only. Cato, Ben, Daniel, Peter, Tom. Men whose full names weren't recorded because they were considered property, not people. Cato was a master stonemason, the kind of skilled craftsman whose expertise was essential for a project like this. Historical records from the Maryland Historical Society show he was hired out by his enslaver for construction work. The government paid his owner $7 per month for Cato's labor. Cato received nothing, but his hands shaped the sandstone blocks that would become the walls. His skill ensured those blocks fit together perfectly. His knowledge of masonry made it possible for this building to stand for over 2 centuries. And until 2016, there wasn't a single plaque, a single mention, a single acknowledgement of his existence anywhere near the building he helped create. The White House cornerstone was laid on October 13, 1792. President George Washington attended the ceremony. There were speeches about the new nation, about liberty, about the future of the Republic. The newspapers covered it. The moment was celebrated. What the newspapers didn't report was that many of the workers building the future symbol of American freedom would never experience that freedom themselves. They worked 12 to 16-hour days. They quarried stone. They mixed mortar. They hauled materials. They built scaffolding. They carved details. And when the day ended, they didn't go home. They returned to quarters provided by the construction site, or to the properties of the men who claimed ownership over them. This wasn't hidden at the time. It was normal, acceptable. The practice of hiring enslaved people for government construction projects was standard in the region. Washington, D.C. was established in territory where slavery was legal. The compromise that created the nation's capital specifically placed it between Maryland and Virginia, both slave states. This wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate political decision. Southern representatives wanted the capital in the South. They got what they wanted. And the consequences of that decision are literally embedded in the stone of the most famous building in America. The White House Historical Association was founded in 1961. Its mission was to preserve and share the history of this iconic building. For decades, official materials focused on presidents, on architecture, on the Irish-born architect James Hoban, who designed it. They talked about the burning by British forces in 1814. They mentioned the renovations under different administrations. They celebrated the grandeur, but they didn't talk about the people whose labor made it possible. Not until pressure from historians and the public forced the conversation. Not until descendants started asking questions. Not until the evidence became too overwhelming to ignore. The truth that was ignored for so long sits in leather-bound ledgers at the National Archives, account books from the commissioners overseeing construction, payroll records, expense reports. They're surprisingly detailed. They list names, tasks, amounts paid. What they reveal is a system that operated with cold efficiency. The federal government didn't own enslaved people for this project. They rented them. It was called slave hire, and it was common practice. Plantation owners, businessmen, even widows with inherited property would lease out the people they enslaved to construction projects, receiving monthly payments while the workers received nothing. The White House was built on this system. Between 1792 and 1800, hundreds of enslaved people cycled through the construction site. Some worked for weeks, others for years. Their labor was purchased the same way you'd rent equipment, and when the project was done, they were returned to their enslavers like tools being put back in storage. Cato, the master stonemason, came from a plantation in Maryland. Historical records indicate he worked on the White House construction for at least 3 years. 3 years of shaping sandstone from the Aquia Creek quarries in Virginia, the same quarries that supplied stone for the Capitol building. Sandstone is soft when first cut, but hardens when exposed to air, making it perfect for carving but requiring skill to work properly. Cato had that skill. He understood how to read the grain of the stone, how to cut it so it wouldn't crack, how to shape it for structural integrity. This wasn't unskilled labor. This was craftsmanship that took years to develop, the kind of expertise that architects and builders relied on. James Hoban, the Irish architect who designed the White House, depended on craftsmen like Cato to turn his drawings into reality. But Hoban's name is carved into history. Cato's was barely recorded at all, just a first name in an account book. Cato, stonemason, hired from Daniel Carroll. That's all the documentation says. No age, no family, no record of what happened to him after the construction ended. Then there was Ben, a carpenter. Account ledgers from 1795 show regular payments to his enslaver for carpentry work on the White House project. Carpenters were crucial during construction. They built the scaffolding that allowed masons to work at height. They framed the interior walls. They constructed the forms that held wet plaster. They created the wooden structures that supported the building as it rose. In the summer of 1795, according to a brief notation in the Commissioner's correspondence held at the Library of Congress, Ben fell from scaffolding while working on the second floor. The letter mentions the incident in passing, noting that the work was delayed 2 days due to an accident. It doesn't say whether Ben survived. It doesn't mention medical treatment. It doesn't record what happened to him after the fall. He simply disappears from the records. His enslaver continued receiving payment for several more months, which might mean Ben recovered and kept working, or it might mean someone else was sent to replace him and the bookkeeping wasn't updated. There's no way to know. What is certain is that Ben's accident wasn't considered significant enough to document beyond a single line noting a construction delay. The work was dangerous in ways that modern construction regulations would never permit. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds hoisted by rope and pulley systems. Scaffolding made from rough timber, sometimes 3 stories high. Lime mortar that burned skin on contact. Summer heat in Washington that regularly exceeded 90 degrees. No safety equipment. No protective gear. No breaks mandated by law. Workers who were injured couldn't refuse to work. They couldn't quit. They couldn't demand better conditions. The people who paid for their labor weren't the people doing the work, which meant there was no incentive to prioritize safety. If someone was injured and couldn't work anymore, their enslaver would simply send a replacement. The system continued regardless of individual suffering. Nellie worked in a different capacity but was just as essential. Kitchen records from the construction site, preserved in the papers of the commissioners, mention a woman listed as Nellie, cook. She prepared meals for the workers at the construction site. This wasn't a small operation. At peak construction, there were dozens of people working simultaneously. Masons, carpenters, laborers, plasterers, glaziers. They all needed to eat. Nellie worked from before dawn, preparing breakfast, through midday meals, into evening, cooking for that many people over open fires, in all weather, without modern equipment. The records show her enslaver received payment for her services from 1794 through 1798. 4 years of labor. 4 years of feeding the men building the president's house. And like Cato and Ben, she disappears from history after the payments stop. No record of her age. No mention of whether she had children who might have been with her. No documentation of what happened to her when the work was finished. The youngest documented worker was 14 years old. The records identify him simply as Daniel, laborer. 14. His job was to haul materials, stones from wagons to work sites, barrels of lime, buckets of water, loads of sand for mortar. Hour after hour, day after day. Construction records from 1796 indicate that Daniel's enslaver received payment for his labor for only 7 months before the payments abruptly stopped. There's no explanation in the ledgers, no note about what happened. Just a line drawn through his name and the payments ceasing. Historians who have studied these records suggest several possibilities. He could have been sold to another enslaver and removed from the site. He could have become too ill to work and been sent back. Or he could have died. Child mortality among enslaved laborers was high. The physical demands, the dangerous conditions, the lack of medical care, all contributed to a reality where young people like Daniel often didn't survive to adulthood. Whatever happened, he vanished from the official record with even less documentation than the adults. A child whose childhood was spent building a mansion for the most powerful person in the nation, while having no power over his own life whatsoever. But the violence embedded in this building doesn't begin with the construction. It starts with the land itself. Before there was a White House, before there was a capital city, before the federal district was even conceived, there were people living on this land, families, communities, property owners, and the story of how that land was acquired reveals a pattern that extends far beyond the exploitation of enslaved workers. It shows how the creation of Washington, D.C. itself required the erasure of the people who were already there. The Residence Act of 1790 authorized the creation of a federal district along the Potomac River. President Washington was given the authority to select the exact location within a designated area. He chose land that straddled Maryland and Virginia, much of it already inhabited and cultivated. This wasn't wilderness. It wasn't empty territory waiting to be claimed. It was farmland. There were established properties, family estates, small agricultural plots worked by both enslaved people and free black landowners. The decision to place the capital here wasn't random. It was political. Northern and southern states had been locked in debate about where to locate the permanent seat of government. The South wanted it in the South. The North wanted it in the North. The compromise, brokered during a private dinner between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson in June of 1790, placed the capital in the South in exchange for Northern support of Hamilton's financial plan to assume state debts from the Revolutionary War. That dinner conversation determined the fate of everyone living in the area that would become Washington, D.C., and none of those residents had any say in the decision. David Burns was a Scottish immigrant who owned one of the largest farms in the area, over 600 acres of productive land where his family had lived for decades. When the federal commissioners arrived to inform him that his property would be purchased for the new capital, Burns initially refused. He didn't want to sell. This was his home, his livelihood, his legacy. But the concept of eminent domain, the government's power to seize private property for public use, left him with limited options. The commissioners offered him what they considered fair market value. Burns argued it was far below what his land was worth. Negotiations dragged on. Eventually, under increasing legal and political pressure, Burns agreed to sell. The compensation he received was a fraction of what he believed his property was worth. His farm disappeared under the planned streets and buildings of the new federal city. His family's history on that land ended because a compromise at a dinner table decided this location served the nation's political needs better than it served the people who actually lived there. Pierce's story is even more obscure, which is exactly why it matters. Historical research conducted by the White House Historical Association in the early 2000s uncovered property records showing that a free black man named Pierce owned a small plot of land in the area that would eventually become part of the White House grounds. The exact location is believed to be where the Rose Garden now sits, though records are incomplete. Pierce was part of a small community of free black landowners in the area sometimes referred to as Georgetown Gap, a section between Georgetown and the planned federal district, where free black families had managed to purchase property and establish small farms. Owning land as a free black person in this era was extraordinarily difficult. It required navigating laws designed to prevent black property ownership, finding white witnesses willing to vouch for transactions, and constantly defending against legal challenges from white neighbors who didn't want black landowners in their vicinity. Pierce had managed all of this. He had a legal deed. He had established his claim. He had built a life on that land. When the federal commissioners began acquiring property for the president's house and surrounding grounds, Pierce was given 60 days to vacate. 60 days to abandon land he legally owned, land he had likely spent years saving to purchase. There was no negotiation. The payment offered was minimal. And unlike white landowners like David Burns, who could hire lawyers and attempt to negotiate better terms, Pierce had virtually no legal recourse. Free black landowners had limited standing in courts. Their testimony was often dismissed. Their property rights, while technically legal, were rarely defended with the same vigor as white landowners' rights. Pierce took the payment he was offered because refusing would have resulted in forced removal with no compensation at all. After accepting the government's terms, Pierce disappears entirely from the historical record. No documentation exists about where he went, whether he was able to purchase land elsewhere, or what became of his family. His property, his home, the land he had fought to own in a society designed to prevent him from owning anything, became part of the landscape surrounding the White House. Today, tourists walk through the Rose Garden during special tours. They admire the flowers, the carefully maintained grounds, the view of the south portico. None of the informational materials mention Pierce. None of the plaques acknowledge that this manicured garden sits on land taken from a free black landowner who had no power to defend his claim. The Georgetown Gap community included several other free black families, though documentation of their names and lives is fragmentary at best. Census records from 1790 suggest there were at least a dozen free black property owners in the immediate area. Some were farmers. Others ran small businesses, A few owned the land where family members who had died were buried, small private cemeteries that served the free black community, because white cemeteries refused to accept black burials. When construction of the federal city began, these cemeteries became obstacles. The planned street grid didn't account for them. Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the French engineer hired to design the city's layout, created grand boulevards and symmetrical patterns that looked impressive on paper but completely ignored the existing communities. Where his design showed Pennsylvania Avenue cutting straight from the Capitol to the President's house, there were homes, farms, and burial grounds. They were all removed. The families were displaced. And the cemeteries, those final resting places where people had buried their loved ones with the expectation that those graves would be respected and maintained, were destroyed to clear the way for the avenue that would become one of the most famous streets in America. There's no comprehensive record of how many graves were disturbed. There's no documentation of whether remains were relocated or simply bulldozed along with everything else. There are no marked mass graves where the displaced remains might have been reinterred. The people buried there, their identities, their stories, their connections to families who mourned them, all of that was erased as efficiently as the living community was displaced. The creators of Washington, D.C. envisioned a capital city that would symbolize the new nation's ideals. But building that vision required treating existing communities, especially black communities, as disposable. Their presence didn't fit the grand design, so they were removed, and the historical record was written as if they had never been there at all. The displacement of communities and the exploitation of enslaved workers during construction were known at the time. They weren't secrets. They were documented in government records, mentioned in correspondence, recorded in account books. But what happened over the following 2 centuries reveals something more insidious than simply forgetting. It reveals an active process of erasure, a deliberate choice to tell only certain parts of the story, while burying others so deep that generations of Americans would grow up never knowing the truth about the building they were taught to revere. The White House became a tourist destination almost immediately after its completion. Even in the 1800s, visitors would come to see the president's residence. By the early 1900s, formal tours were established. Tour guides told stories about the architecture, about the famous residence, about historical events that occurred within those walls. They talked about James Hoban's Georgian design inspired by Leinster House in Dublin. They mentioned the British burning the building during the War of 1814 and the subsequent reconstruction. They described renovations under Theodore Roosevelt and Harry Truman. They pointed out the East Room, the State Dining Room, the Blue Room with its elegant oval shape. What they didn't mention, tour after tour, decade after decade, were the people who actually built those rooms. The guides never said, "Enslaved workers quarried this stone," or "The hands that carved these details belonged to people who would never be free." It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. The White House Historical Association was established in 1961 by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy with the mission of preserving and sharing the history of the residence. It's a respected institution that has published numerous books, created educational materials, and maintained detailed records about the building's history. But for the first 4 decades of its existence, the association's publications barely mentioned enslaved workers. A researcher going through their materials from the 1960s through the 1990s would find extensive information about every president who lived there, every major renovation, every piece of furniture and artwork. They would find chapters about the architectural significance of the building, about the symbolism of different design elements, about the social history of state dinners and diplomatic receptions. But they would find almost nothing about the people who built it. Not because the information didn't exist. The account books were available in the National Archives the entire time, but because including that information would complicate the narrative that the association and the National Park Service wanted to present. It would force visitors to confront an uncomfortable truth about the foundation of American democracy. And for decades, the decision was made that visitors shouldn't have to confront that truth. Even the language used to describe enslaved workers evolved in ways that obscured reality. In the rare instances when publications from the 1950s and 60s mentioned the people who worked at the White House, they were often called servants or staff. The word enslaved was avoided. This linguistic shift made it seem like these were employees, people who had chosen to work there and received compensation. It erased the fundamental truth that they had no choice, no freedom, no wages. The servants' quarters in the White House were, for generations, presented as housing for household staff, without acknowledging that many of the people who lived and worked in those spaces during the building's early decades were enslaved. The tours didn't lie outright, but they told the story in a way that allowed visitors to avoid confronting the reality of slavery's role in creating this iconic building. It was history by omission, and it was remarkably effective. The shift began slowly in the early 2000s, driven not by the institutions responsible for the building's official history, but by outside researchers and activists who refused to let the omissions stand. Historians began publishing papers specifically about enslaved workers and the construction of federal buildings in Washington. Genealogists working with descendants of enslaved families started documenting names and stories. The pressure built gradually. In 2000, during archaeological work on the White House grounds related to infrastructure improvements, workers uncovered remains that appeared to be from burial sites predating the current structure. The discovery was handled quietly. The remains were studied, documented, and reinterred, but there was minimal public discussion about what their presence meant, about whose bodies these might have been, about whether they belonged to displaced community members or workers who had died during construction. The finding raised questions that the National Park Service seemed reluctant to answer in detail. Then, in July of 2016, Michelle Obama delivered a speech at the Democratic National Convention. Standing at the podium, the first African-American First Lady of the United States said something that had never been said so explicitly by anyone in her position. "I wake up every morning in a house that was built by slaves." 8 words, a simple, undeniable statement of historical fact. But it was a fact that had been carefully avoided in official White House discourse for over 200 years. Her words forced a national conversation. News outlets ran stories about the enslaved workers. Historians were interviewed. The White House Historical Association suddenly faced questions about why this information had been so thoroughly buried in their materials. Within months, new exhibits were planned. Educational materials were revised. The association published a detailed report identifying 305 names of enslaved individuals who had worked on the White House or in the surrounding federal buildings during the early years of Washington, D.C. 305 names recovered from dusty account books, payroll ledgers, and construction records. 305 people who had been left out of the official story for 2 centuries. But even that number is incomplete. Researchers acknowledge that the true total was likely between 600 and 800 workers, but many records have been lost or destroyed, and many enslaved people were never individually recorded at all, listed only as laborers or hands without names. The conversation Michelle Obama started didn't end with her speech. It opened a door that couldn't be closed again. In 2017, the White House Visitor Center, the facility where tourists begin their tours, unveiled a new permanent exhibit specifically focused on the enslaved workers who built the residence. The exhibit includes the names that researchers have been able to confirm, displays copies of the original account ledgers showing payments to enslavers, and provides context about the practice of slave hire in federal construction projects. It's a significant step. But it's also a testament to how long the truth was kept out of the official narrative. The White House has stood for over 220 years. This exhibit has existed for less than a decade. Generations of Americans visited this building, learned about its history, studied it in school, and never encountered this fundamental part of its story. In September of 2020, 228 years after the cornerstone was laid, the White House Historical Association installed a commemorative marker on the grounds acknowledging the contribution of enslaved workers to the construction. 228 years. The plaque is tasteful, respectful, historically accurate. It lists some of the names that have been recovered and acknowledges that many more remain unknown. But standing in front of that marker, it's impossible not to think about the time that elapsed between the building's construction and this recognition. Multiple lifetimes, entire generations who were born, lived, and died without ever seeing their ancestors' labor acknowledged. The marker exists now because pressure from historians, descendants, and the public made it impossible to continue the silence. Not because the institutions responsible for preserving this history decided on their own that the truth needed to be told. The physical evidence of these workers' presence is still there, embedded in the structure itself. The sandstone blocks that form the exterior walls were cut and shaped by hands that were never free. When modern stonemasons repair or restore sections of the original walls, they're touching stone that Cato and other enslaved craftsmen worked on over 2 centuries ago. The foundation, the columns, the intricate carvings around doorways and windows, all of it bears the literal imprint of enslaved labor. Tourists who visit today walk on floors supported by beams that were placed by carpenters like Ben. They admire architectural details created by workers whose full names we'll never know. The building itself is a monument to their skill, even though for most of its existence it served as a monument only to the presidents who lived there and the architects who designed it. The remains discovered during archaeological excavations in 2000 have never been fully identified. DNA testing was attempted but proved inconclusive. The bones were eventually reinterred on the grounds, but without identification, there's no way to know whose they were. Were they from the displaced community members whose burial grounds were destroyed when the federal city was built? Were they workers who died during construction and were buried on site? There's no definitive answer. What is certain is that people who were connected to this place, who lived here or worked here or were laid to rest here, remain beneath the surface, their identities lost to history because the records weren't kept, or were deliberately destroyed, or were simply never made in the first place. The White House sits on top of stories that will never be fully recovered, lives that will never be fully documented, because the people keeping records at the time didn't think those lives were worth recording. The irony of Barack Obama's presidency is impossible to ignore in this context. The first African-American president, the descendant of enslaved people, lived for 8 years in a house built by enslaved people. He walked halls constructed by workers who looked like his ancestors. He worked in offices whose walls were raised by people who would never have been allowed to enter as guests, let alone as residents. Obama himself addressed this during his time in office, acknowledging the profound historical weight of that reality. It's a testament to how far the nation has come that his presidency was possible, but it's also a reminder of how recent that progress is. The workers who built the White House died generations before anyone who looked like them could imagine living there. The distance between Cato shaping stones for the residents and Obama taking the oath of office is not that many generations. The building has stood long enough to witness both realities. The walls that were built by enslaved hands have housed both the enslavers and the descendants of the enslaved. That transformation is significant, but it doesn't erase the foundation. It doesn't change how the building came to exist. Every year, 1.5 million people still visit the White House. They still take photos from behind the fence on Pennsylvania Avenue. They still tour the public rooms when they can get tickets. They still learn about presidents and state dinners and historical moments. Now, some of them also learn about Cato and Ben and Daniel and Nellie and the hundreds of others whose names are slowly being recovered from forgotten ledgers. Some of them stand in front of the memorial marker and read the names listed there. Some of them visit the visitor center exhibit and see the account books that documented labor but not humanity. But many still don't. Many visitors come and go without encountering this history, either because they don't visit the right exhibits or because they choose not to engage with the parts of the story that complicate their image of what this building represents. The truth is available now in ways it wasn't before. But making the truth available isn't the same as ensuring everyone encounters it. The White House can be two things simultaneously. It can be a symbol of American democracy and a building constructed through American slavery. It can represent the nation's highest ideals and embody the nation's deepest contradictions. Recognizing both realities doesn't diminish the presidency or the importance of the institution. It just makes the story complete. And the complete story, the one that includes Cato's hands shaping stones, and Pierce losing his land and Ben falling from scaffolding, and Daniel hauling materials at 14, and Nellie cooking meals over open fires, and all the others whose labor made this building possible. That story is the one that actually honors the full weight of American history. Not the sanitized version that was told for 2 centuries. The real one. The one that's still being recovered, one name at a time, from ledgers that were kept but never meant to be read this way.